greatest nation of the realms no one knows exists. It's the unofficial and fairly accurate model for that walled-off and heavily guarded section of Polaron. If you didn't live within those walls, you weren't likely to have ever heard it, or have a reason to believe it. However, those that live or do business there are fully aware of the truth of it, and they are proud of both the important place they hold within the realms, and the fact that their import is not known by those very realms. It allows for all the benefits and wealth, without the fear of being the target of politics from such wider realms. We had enough of that kind of trouble all on our own. With our own. I took a long pull of the pipe as the woman who asked about my knowledge of old Polaron and my time there sat in the chair that I had indicated. Smiling, I began in earnest as I sat in my own recliner. From the outside, the 40-foot high walls that separate the rest of Polaron from roughly a 30-square-mile district of what appears to be 2- and 3-story buildings. Maybe there's a few tens of thousands that live or work there. From above, they can be seen sometimes through the many layers of fog and smoke from the factories and other workspaces at the old city. These clouds of fog and smoke always hang low to the building tops, and are nearly a solid barrier most of the time, with only the glow of diffused lights brightening it in patches. These clouds and smoke are kept contained by those high outer walls of old Polaron, essentially sealing in the entire area beneath it. Like many things in old Polaron, this is a deception. The old city borders, in fact, contain a pocket space, a fold in reality, one in which a massive city within a city is kept. More than 40 cubes, each a mile long, wide, as well as high, spaced out and arranged into 9 columns across 17 vertical levels. That's old Polaron. Each cube is practically a small city unto itself, with housing, commercial, industrial, and mercantile venues and systems in place. And, with the exception of 9th level, that's the only level where all 9 columns have a cube present. Each is left to handle their affairs and matters on their own for the most part. Instead of tens of thousands of people, it's closer to 10 million residents, spread across the cubes, of course. Well over that if you count the webs and their undocumented population. Each cube is bound by the overall rules and laws of the city of Polaron, of course, but in most civil matters, the recognized mayor of each cube is given a large amount of latitude in what can and cannot be done within his or her cube. What groups are allowed to rent what facilities, and how much they are charged for its use. These are but a simple example of the powers of the mayors. Most mayors are elected locally in some manner or another, and then confirmed by 9th level. And some are appointed and installed by 9th level, when, in their opinion, the welfare of the cube is not being properly tended by those currently in or near power. 9th level is the official administration and governmental center of old Polaron, and it is from there that most of the intercube affairs of any magnitude or importance are addressed. The old Polaron prison is said to be in the center cube of 9th level, and from all accounts, it is not a pleasant place to stay. The main centers for most governmental functions that are needed for Old Polaron can be found on 9th level. Large-scale maintenance and construction teams, various courts and administrators, as well as the bulk of local law enforcement. Well, each cube has a handful of sheriffs or constables on a semi-permanent basis, all under the provisional direction of a marshal who reports to the mayor. As with most places in the realms, these are not intended to handle more than minor local matters. When events of a nature beyond this occur, the mayors or their marshals are able to request the assistance of the various experts and specialists of 9th level to come in and render assistance. My artificial right lens, the replacement for an eye lost to foolishness, noted my audience was becoming weary of my foundation laying, beginning to cast glances at the many crystals and knickknacks that festoon my parlor. And thus, I continued to what she is no doubt interested in. And that's where I come in. Or, more accurately, that is where I used to come in. Almost a century as an investigator. Most of it as a lead or primary investigator. And I was used to being called in to solve every sort of crime you could imagine. Murders, thefts, extortions, even things as seemingly minor as unauthorized energy taps. But, to be fair to the taps case, it was a significant power being stolen and rerouted, accounting for nearly 2% of the cube in question's total, in fact. We were also the ones called into to look into the webs, those unofficial and normally unpatrolled areas in the spaces between the cubes. You see, each cube is connected and supported to those around it via large, segmented bonds. And in the gaps on each level where a cube is not present for a column, these bonds crisscross to aid in both the greater structure of Old Polaron, as well as to act as transit and power transfer between the cubes, supplementing the direct bond between each adjacent cube. This crisscross has been built on and up over the years, with vast lengths of cables and wires, interlinking and spread out for buildings and other constructions to be made upon them. From a distance, it appears as a vast spider's web in the hollows between cubes, hence the name. Her lights leaned forward, made it clear that she wanted to know more, her eyes back to focusing on me instead of my decor. The webs, for the most part, are lawless regions where those that wish to be left alone or unobserved choose to make their home. In the upper 8 levels, they are less dense and not nearly as heavily built up as those found amongst the low 8. And this is due to the affluence and wealth of upper 8. Its residents are able to pay for regular patrols to ensure flying traffic is both safe from bandits and shipjackers, as well as to keep any expansion of the webs from interfering with the many flight paths in and out of those areas. The webs on the low 8, by contrast, only tend to have 1 or 2 main routes for air traffic, but they have any number of sky alleys. Tight and extremely confusing passageways barely large enough for a standard sky ship to traverse comfortably. There are local pathfinders who are more than willing to guide pilots along the most current and safest of paths for a modest fee. Otherwise, only the main routes are generally safe to use, and while they do allow ready access to the main docks or entrance of a cube, The use of sky alleys will more often than not get a ship far closer to where it actually needs to be, and faster than milling through the main sky docks. Normally, major issues within the webs are handled by the Dragon Knights, and unless someone like me's followed a crime or had an investigation take us into the webs, it is reports of raiders and shipjackers that gain attention from ninth level, and thus the dispatching of a response team. When it comes to these sorts of issues, nothing quite has the impact of a team of Dragon Knights flying in to absolutely ruin some shipjacker or raider's day in blooms of various energy and overwhelming violence. However, as I said, investigations in the cubes lead to the nearby webs often, and thus, if you've been doing the job long at all, you'll get to know the people and the groups amongst them. Most web folk, in my opinion, are good people, only wanting to avoid the restrictions and the costs that one cube or another may have. Many actually work in the cubes, living out in the webs to save on costs while enjoying good pay and other benefits, without having a default rent or rule set by a mayor. The only cost that's regular in the webs is that of securing energy for your home or its Chris-Tech features. Thanks to the various collectives and benefactors that make up the communities of the webs, only rarely is that power stolen or not paid for. While there are protection rackets that impose a sort of rent on the web folk, this is often made as part and parcel of an agreement for regular and constant power, and are often far cheaper rates than in the cubes themselves, but come with a very real benefit of protection from local ne'er-do-wells, as well as knowing that the stuffed shirts of ninth level aren't going to be concerned about or even know that you are there, much less be able to find you. Of course, I haven't seen the current state of things. I've been retired for the better part of 2 centuries at this point. After a century in the Investigators Guild, and a career consisting of several cases of some import, I managed to retire with full honors. A rarity, as most in my line of work would either meet a grisly end after crossing the wrong person, or be discharged for failures of duty, most commonly corruption and malfeasance. The last arches an eyebrow looking at me, perhaps in disbelief such things happen, or perhaps that I would speak of it. Now don't get me wrong, the pay is good, but nothing to cheer about. Benefits are alright, but are limited in their usefulness for someone who is so often not in their home cube. Neither is to the point that the temptation to pad one's wallet with extracurricular employment opportunities is ever negated in any real way. I always saw that as a hidden test of moral and character. I figured once I retired as I did, with all honors and commendations intact and not a black mark on my record, that I would have received some gift or memento to celebrate reward my steadfastness. Nothing. Not a single copper beyond that stipulated as pension, not even a note of appreciation. More than enough for me to make the move back home to the sparkling halls of Stone Gem and busy myself with forays into crystal craft and rune carving, however. I looked at the woman, an elf of some minor house, and smiled. She had arrived not an hour before and had made it clear that she had been looking for me. Dargon Stone Shaper. She further had explained that she was seeking my services to investigate why her contact, a family member by the sound of it, had stopped responding to missives and letters. Elves. They are like dancers with their words, with truth often concealed in inference and left between the lines of eloquently delivered and articulated statements. And this was especially true when matters of faith or honor were at stake. What made it more interesting is the fact that this last chose to seek me out at all. Sure, retiring as I did was rare, but there must have been any number of elves of a similar stripe she could have sought out locally. Again, this points to it being a matter of elven status and honor. But either way, this young lady was giving nothing away, being concise and economical with her words. She explained she wanted me to find out what happened to her contact and resolve any outstanding debts or other issues they might be in trouble for, then escort the contact back to Avlin. So, that's why she'd asked for my pass there. My former position ensured I would be able to access Old Polaron without the piles of paperwork and fees that a hunter or other outsider would have to deal with. This was most likely the main reason for her seeking someone like me out. That access alone is worth half the fee. When she asked what I would charge to take the job on, I quoted her an outrageous amount. I was retired after all, and this had the ring of trouble. 5 plat a day. Twice that if I have to deal in the webs or with 9th level. The elf didn't blink, only nodding for me to continue. 3 times that if I have to go to the upper 8 or deal with the docks in Wider City. Plus expenses, of course, and those are to be accounted for and settled weekly. She only nodded and withdrew a sheath of papers bound in leather. Setting it on my desk, she then pulled out a smaller package wrapped in leather and set it down on top of the papers, and then slid the stack towards me with a wry smile. Taking the smaller package and opening it slightly, I was stunned. 5 plaques of platinum, all neatly set together and minted by different nations. 5 million standard gold in the palm of my hand. It was more than I had ever earned in all my years. And all for essentially wrangling a wayward family member. The ring of trouble indeed. The question is, what kind? As I looked up, I noticed she was already gone, the door to my home slowly closing behind her. A slip of paper between the plaques with a Trebucom address to send all updates and receipts was the only method of contact she had left, other than the address of a house in Avlin I was to escort the wayward one to once I had found him. The sheath of papers was a fairly detailed dossier on her contact and what was known of his situation until he had stopped replying. Looking it over, I sighed. His home was in Center Cube of Upper 3. Aristocrats and nobility everywhere once you get that high, each playing their games with and against each other. This was going to be trouble, I knew it. But for 5 million gold, probably shouldn't expect anything less. Best to get moving. I have to pack my things and prepare to head back to the greatest nation the realm doesn't know exists. As a sky ship flies above gray, rain-filled clouds, The sun begins to set in the west. Peals of red and orange paint the sky above, and to the east, the first pinpoints of starlight were just beginning to be visible. Two of Jam'mar's 3 moons, Gavain and Nodell, were high but separate in the evening sky. The first, a soft blue-green, while Nodell's lifeless and barren rocky surface shone a bright silver where the setting sun was not obstructed by either Jam'mar or her other moons. On this eve, however, both moons were full and bright, and when reflected off the top of the gray clouds below, the air was filled with a soft, ambient glow, more than enough for the crew and passengers to enjoy being on the deck of the craft with no problems of vision. As the sky continued its fade into night, the passengers dined and drank, taking their time to enjoy not only the meal, but of their company as well. Couples, families, as well as those looking for a getaway had booked this vessel nearly completely full, and this was not unusual for skyships bound for Polaron, that capital of entertainment and trade on Solaris's eastern edge. After dinner, most found amusement elsewhere on the vessel, leaving only a scant handful of groups on the deck as the sun finished its dip below the edge of the western sky, letting night fully set in with its stellar light show able to be taken in. The skies of Jam'mar were filled with many stars, many to which the realms have expanded in the current age. In fact, several of the groups had one or more people pointing here and there in the sky, naming systems and stars as well as other relevant trivia to impress their fellow passengers. Most of them were even accurate to boot. A welcome and amusing observation that Daragon Stone Shaper had come to as he watched not the wonders of the stars in the skies, but the wonders of the various groups of people on the deck. Old habits of a profession he had prided himself in had begun to re-emerge. People watching was a long-time pastime of his, but the mechanical categorization and assessment of each person looked at was something he had almost forgotten about until his companion, a young gnome, asked him what was so entrancing about the crowds he was looking at. Reshlink Tinkerstone had been a near shadow of Daragon for most of the past decade, proclaiming himself Daragon's student and protégé shortly after meeting him. Despite all protestations, the gnome, who was a bit tall and wide for a gnome, features a bit too sharp. He had persevered through every banal task or skewed test that Daragon had placed before him. Resh had shown an amazing aptitude for critical thinking and investigative rigor, and for the past few years, Daragon had all but officially accepted him as his student. Resh was, by far, Daragon's closest confidant, and even as Daragon tried to slip away unbeknownst to Resh on this job, Resh simply met him at the skydock with fare already paid, as yet another example of how well he had taken the old dwarf's lessons to heart. That had been hours ago, and as they watched the sky, the people, and the crew, the two began to talk of things both relevant to the upcoming job and of things of the past. Daragon's suspicions as to Resh's lineage were confirmed, as Resh began a particularly amusing tale of his grandfather on his mother's side, a dwarf, escaping from a group of bandits he had just defended by seeking to hide amongst a group of gnomish travelers just leaving the town that he was in at the time. Of course, Resh's grandmother was among them, but it was the fact that it was a stage troupe of actors, acrobats, and other performers that made the efforts of Resh's grandfather a humorous tale, as the dwarf in question was a humble man of mines and forges, not stage and lights, so struggled with the concepts of stage makeup, with particular disdain to the idea of dyeing his hair or beard. Daragon instinctively clutched and stroked his own great silver beard, as Resh related an incident involving his grandfather's beard, some elfin curlers, and a precon, and only stopped when a twist or turn to the story would cause Daragon to deeply chuckle and laugh mirthfully. Less than a day later, Daragon, Stoneshaper, and Resh Link Tinkerstone found themselves enjoying the hospitality of an old friend of Daragon, who had lived in old Polaron for far longer than even he had, known only as Master Smith Runescale, a dark gray, rune-covered dwarf of ancient lineage. As the flames of the forge shift and danced, causing the shadows to likewise move and swerve, the older dwarf and his guest shared both drink and humor in equal measure. Having arrived in Polaron that morning, Daragon and Resh had had a bit of a tour of the city for Resh, as it was his first time in Polaron. Resh was understandably awed by the size and scale of Jam'mar's grandest trade city, from the Colosseum to the Grand Circus of the High Quarter. And soon enough, Resh understood why Daragon chose to take his time with heading to the old city, as their matter of entry was less than official, and its preparation no doubt a second reason for many of their stops. Entering the old city via an underground path, led through various tunnels and secret corridors, they emerged at the base of the great towers of cubes and webs that made up old Polaron. The awe that Resh Link had felt looking at the mile-tall and square Colosseum was washed away as he realized that each of these cubes was at least as large, and they stretched into the sky beyond his ability to see. 17 levels of a cube each, with hundreds of feet in between each. The very scale made his head spin until they had entered a sky carriage, and his attention was instead held by Daragon, instructing him on how he was to behave when they arrived at their first proper destination. They were going to meet a dwarven half-dragon mastersmith, and there were protocols to be observed for how one was to deal with such a master craftsman, particularly when they carried the blood and power of an elder race in their veins. As had been apparent quite quickly, Runescale was a man from a different age, as well as incredibly skilled in the arts of the forge and all forms of dwarven rune and crystal craft. His forge and the large home that contained it were covered in runes and decorated with works of crystal, metal, and gem that were as beautiful as they were functional and practical. The mastersmith was the one who had forged Daragon's artificial replacement for his lost eye, as was made quite clear when he removed it in a smooth flourish, almost as soon as Daragon had released the initial clasping of their arms in greeting. As Daragon more or less accepted this with resigned grumbles, Resh had nearly launched into a violent defense of his teacher. Of course, the warnings given on the way had kept his instinct in check, as did the piercing single glance the mastersmith shot him. Without Daragon's enhanced eye, only Resh was able to see the slight curl of the lip that accompanied the look of warning, and he knew to his core, if he had not restrained himself, he would have done nothing but become a stain on the floor. After performing some work on the eye, it was returned, and as Daragon relaxed, being able to see normally again, so too did Resh. That was until much later, and after many drinks, and telling several stories of his parents and the troop they had been a part of, that the mastersmith queried as to when Resh became aware of the truth of his parentage. At first the gnome appeared to not understand what the old dwarf was talking about, as he had been quite open about the fact that his grandfather had been one of the dwarven kin. Runescale, however, persisted, stating that if Resh was truly going to be Daragon's protege, he needed to be honest now, and that the deceptions of the Analar are forever a stain upon them and their progeny, requiring extraordinary levels of honesty to achieve a similar level of trust as almost any other. With Daragon's stare now fixed on him squarely, Resh sighed and began to explain how his father, who, for the entirety of Resh's life, and for at least several decades before meeting his mother and falling in love, had presented himself as a gnome in all ways, and had never revealed the fact that he was an Analar. Resh confessed that he didn't even know if his mother had been aware of the truth before they had both died in a freak quake collapsing the tunnels the troop was traveling in Campton, and Resh had been sent off to be fostered by an Analar of some note, apparently to learn what form his gifts would take, and how best to ensure that he could both control and use them effectively. With a shrug of his shoulders, Rushlink Tinkerstone's wings began to coalesce into being, shaped from interplanar energies and matter, and shimmering like liquid metals of differing hues and tints. They were as small as he was, but he was clear that they were very functional, and he had spent many years learning how to incorporate the acrobatics of his stage life with the freedom of range his wings could provide. However, he also said he quickly came to the conclusion that in most cases, his acrobatic skills were more than enough, and his wings served to only draw attention, and often the less than welcome kind. Soon after Resh's reveal and the dismissal of his wings, laughter again rang out, as the mastersmith heartily congratulated the gnome for his honesty and bravery, and once more tales, rumors, and other stories were again exchanged as drink flowed once more. To Daragon's practiced ear, however, Resh laughed more deeply and freely than he had ever before, no longer weighed down by this secret. And this brought a thin smile to Daragon's lips, for he was only beginning to truly understand the depth that Resh respected and regarded him. How the old mastersmith knew of Resh's secret, Daragon was unsure, but he silently thanked the cantankerous old dwarf for his action, as Resh would no longer feel bound to hide his nature from Daragon at the expense of the gnome's safety. Soon, the volume of brew consumed began to have its effect, and Resh excused himself to bed, having been told where he could find one by the mastersmith, who was happy to have guests in his home. After the gnome had said his parting quips and wandered off, Daragon and the mastersmith began to speak in earnest about the matters of the apparently wayward elf he was hired to find. RuneScale had bad news on that matter, as the elf in question had been discovered in his estate, slain by unknown means, only 3 days ago. The estate was sealed and had a standing dragon knight at its gate, with the official record stating that the investigation was open, but had no leads. Of curiosity to both of the dwarves, the estate was seen to have a string of people coming in and out before it was sealed. Far more than just investigators and other expected personnel, and the mastersmith was at loss as to the reason, beyond the fact that several had been identified to be licensed hunters known to work closely with various powers and interests across the realms. RuneScale handed a crystal containing the sum of the information to Daragon, and inquired as to the retired investigator's next move. Daragon stood to find his way to his own room, and merely replied that he would have to report to his client, but only after he had confirmed the truth of things. The timing was way too convenient, he thought, as he had only been hired a day before the death, and while he believed coincidence was a real thing, he had never been able to trust it whenever it appeared. Even if his quarry was indeed dead, Daragon was also hired to settle any outstanding debts or affairs the elf might have had. At the very least, he would take the rest of the week to ensure that things were in order before making contact with his client, as to not waste the time of a potentially grieving client. He also silently wanted to be ready, for if his client chose to have him seek justice for this now dead elf, and that required him to reacquaint himself with the old city and its ebbs and flows. If this investigation was indeed stalled right out of the gate, it was likely that things were going to be complicated and would require as much preparation as could be had if he and Resh were to succeed and survive. Security detail is often boring and quiet. It was no different today, even if the location that was under seal and guard was a lavish estate in Central Cube, Upper 3 of Old Polaron. With the other access points to the estate well secured, the only point of entry, and thus the only one requiring a physical presence, was a private skydock attached to the property. While it was not a small area, capable of allowing even sizable delivery transports to both dock and offload, the degree of influence and power involved not only with the owners of this estate, but of the cube in general, saw this task made far easier by the vast arrays of security and defensive systems employed by the nobility and merchant lords that lived here. As such, it comes as little surprise that a single Dragon Knight was thought more than sufficient to the task. The knight sitting in the dock's control room, lazily reading the day's copy of various newspapers and other such periodicals that saw production and distribution across Old City. In particular, he was sure that his towns were being used more to curry favor by 9th level than to his being placed here in hopes of preventing some sort of interference to an ongoing investigation. Investigation. That was being generous. The poor sod who lived here, involved in the production of various shipping containers used in the transit systems used in Old City, was slain in a most brutal fashion. And from the get-go, the trail was cold. The attackers used unknown means to disrupt the scene, and most of the rest of the estate. This disruption made it so the various means that were typically employed to try and investigate crimes would not be of use. The psychic memory of the place, the spirits of it, as well as the more technological methods of recording events were likewise damaged beyond recovery. With no evidence, and the corpse so heavily damaged and disrupted itself as to bar any use of it to try to commune with the dead man's spirit, there was simply nothing to go on. There was more to things, as the night's presence clearly showed. In the hours after the murder had been discovered, the order to seal the estate and a summons to the night was already done and prepared. In the days after, he had seen a dozen groups, all with the proper paperwork, enter and leave, each taking paperwork and sealed binders with them. Many of them were hunters, and those of significant rank. The lowest rank the knight had seen was that of a topaz, and all of them were known to be regular agents of certain powers across the realms. This dead elf, it seemed, was in business with a number of powerful folks, all of whom wanted their privileged materials returned, and thus the political might of the situation was made a bit clearer. Simple as it may sound, the internal transit system of Old City Polaron requires that all crates be of specific standards. To ensure no disasters happen, those few groups certified to build such crates are stringently tested over and regularly to ensure quality. However, with the vast production in the Old City, new items and design requirements for crates are not uncommon, and the designs and construction of proper and legal crates is often seen as a matter of state security, as even the details of these crates could lend insight as to its contents and their eventual use. Old Polaron's place as a supplier of mass-produced goods saw nearly every sovereignty and power place some of its logistical needs to be met by the factories of its many cubes. So almost all had an interest in such matter, and likely the self's death was likely tied to it. Without clues or leads, all was left now was for his former partners to retrieve what was theirs, and hope whichever one of them had most likely been behind this grisly act was finished, and that this was not a start to some sort of power struggle or its like. When each hunter and their group was debriefed on their return back to their home cities and states, they all had glowing reports of both the cooperation of the Old City and of the blunt but helpful manner of the Dragon Knight guarding the estate. What would not be discovered for some time, and only then after a scribe was compiling a collection of these reports, was that according to the records provided by the Old City, only a singular knight was assigned and on duty for the duration of the estate's sealing, for security reasons. But, according to the debriefings once they're collated, no less than 5 different scales of knight were reported as on guard. Or scales of concept. One even reported stating the knight was of the scale of diamond. And each of these was an independent sighting and group of the other. Every group that had gone to the estate said they met a knight of a different scale, despite all of them using the same name. Set Trends. This was foolish, of course, as a Dragon Knight cannot just change his scale, can they? The last few weeks had been full of activity for Daragon's protege, if not for the old dwarf himself. Things had gone well initially. Daragon had spoken with his employer, and after some negotiation, he was now tasked with righting this wrong, with all due and required extreme prejudice, was the exact wording, and the elf had some pull, having Daragon named as an independent investigator into the matter by request of the Crown of Avlen. A fine bit of courtly pressure being exerted, Daragon had said, and combined with whatever other concessions he had been promised, he assured Resh Link that after this he would be able to return home satisfied in not only rendering justice, but in honoring ancient duties in ways undreamt of. He almost sounded excited at the prospect. Soon after, Resh and Daragon were meeting on the 9th level in the halls of law. Many an elf, dwarf, or those of other lived species waved and greeted Daragon by name as they had arrived and made their way to their appointed place. For each, Daragon had a nod or a few word or questions, leaving no act of greeting unreturned. Resh was astonished, as he had never seen the old dwarf act so comfortably in a setting such as this. If Resh had been astonished before, he was all but struck dumb as they entered what appeared to be the personal office of the highest court of Polaron, with the Lord Arbiter and the Lord Marshal awaiting them. Daragon greeting both with warm jabs about increased portions of now graying hair, or wider waists, being returned with queries regarding the old dwarf's sight and senility, laughter being the resultant answer from both sides. As Resh quickly recovered his wits and the meeting was truly underway, it was clear there would be little help from the local authorities in what they considered a cold case. They would not interfere in Daragon's efforts, but they could not justify allocating resources or personnel to the matter. Their stance softened slightly after Daragon offered to allow them to claim any glory for his efforts as an out-of-retirement investigator. Daragon nor his client cared if 9th level took the win. Getting the win was their priority. Even with this concession, there was little that was on offer beyond the use of facilities and of the archives. Access to the scene was already taken care of for the two of them. Daragon thanked them and asked only for an updated remote access pass to the archives, tied to RuneScale's Holdings communication systems, to avoid bothering the various aides on tasks that he could well handle himself. A few more matters of legality and protocol later, and they were on their way to the scene, the estate of the slain elf. Arriving and meeting the Dragon Knight protecting the estate and ensuring the seal was maintained. Again, one of Daragon's former associates from his service as an investigator, Set Trends, a Manaree. After being allowed into the estate, the two began a thorough examination of the grounds, working their way to the main house. Finding nothing of note beyond the lavish excess that was to be expected for such wealth, they moved into the main building and continued their search for answers or clues, leaving Set Trends manning his post at the skydock, chuckling at a parting jest from Daragon. They had split up to look at each room independently and then together as they moved through one section and wing at a time. It had been hours by the time they arrived in the main central hall where the death had occurred, and it had yet to be cleaned, beyond the removal of the body for transport home for burial, of course. Comparing notes, it was clear that the initial investigators had not missed anything, although the state of the building currently was not anywhere near what it would have been at the time that they would have been conducting their duties. The groups that had come to claim property and files had not exactly been gentle while recovering it, leaving many rooms in a state of disarray, complicating matters for the two investigators. They had only begun to share their findings in full when an explosion and the sound of battle erupted from the skydock, followed closely by the back door being burst through. Moments later, a pair of humans, wielding strange halberds made of spinning blades and edged cogs, floating on similarly spinning discs of death and edge, flew into the chamber, and as one, flew at Daragon and Resh with decidedly lethal intent. Daragon had his heirloom axe drawn and ready, and with a movement of his hands, Resh was encompassed by 2 rings of ghostly, transparent swords, shields, spears, and other tools of battle. Moving as one themselves, Daragon pointed the head of his axe at his attacker and fired a single bolt from its built-in Crystal-Tech heavy bolts launcher, and Resh struck out with his hands with a pair finger extended, summoning a spear sized for a human, appearing and thrusting past the guard of his on-rushing assailant. As the heavy bolt passed through the skull of Daragon's target, Resh's spear, having come from under his attacker's jaw in an upward motion, punched through the back of his would-be killer's head before fading away. The momentary reprieve their quick victory granted was almost immediately broken by the sounds of escalating combat from the skydock. Both Resh, with his weapons floating around him as he moved with the speed and grace reflecting his youth on the stage, and Daragon, whose pace was no less hurried, if a bit slower, as his age showed ever so subtly, rushed to the aid of the Dragon Knight, who was battling no less than 6 more of these strange attackers. The battle they joined only lasted a minute or 2 longer at most, ending with all the attackers slain. However, in that brief time, Daragon had been thrown from the skydock and crashed into a passing transport several hundred feet below. Resh had leapt from the dock in pursuit of his teacher and friend, while an enraged Set Tens took full dragon form and finished the battle in a decidedly messy manner. Resh used his acrobatic skills, combined with his array of grapple-like tools from his years as a performer and acrobat, to swing and control his descent and effect his pursuit of the transport as it flew to whatever its destination was. Only the most keen of eyes would have caught the momentary manifestations of translucent liquid metal rings at key points as Resh made his way along the skylane, closing the gap with the transport in a flowing rush of grapple lines and parkour across the various skyships and other traffic. After catching the transport and finding Daragon, it was a relief for Resh discovering he lived, if only barely. Even after various magical mendings, Daragon would need weeks to recover before he could be on his feet for more than a few minutes. And that left the heavy lifting of the investigation to Resh and the new arrival, a Teltechian man named Conson. Conson had been brought in by their dwarven host Runescale, as their attackers had been members of a local web gang known as the Buzzblades. And Conson, as a Teltechian and former member of their colony defense rangers, was familiar with them. The Buzzblades were one of a collection of gangs that had spread themselves across the realms from their home in Newarth, and Conson had dealt with their ilk before. The next weeks consisted of the two being handed lists of leads to check by Runescale and Daragon in the mornings, with the 2 dwarves in deep reflection over previously obtained evidence and records recovered from the estate by Daragon that were kept safe during the fall in one of his many magical storage pouches. Exactly what had been recovered wasn't clear, but they had no lack of leads from it to pursue. Conson and his 4 psi-forms, each between 1 foot and 1.5 feet in height, were quite novel to Resh, as he had never met a Teltechian with multiple psi-forms, or any Teltechian before, really. His curiosity would have to wait, as his focus was on other mysteries, however. Resh was conducting a second search as they went from lead to lead, finding nothing but dead ends or dull, uninformative explanations of shipping or building codes and procedures. Daragon's axe had been lost in the battle, as it did not land with him on the transport. It was perhaps the only thing beyond his cane that Resh knew the old dwarf had left of his family. He didn't know the details, only that the house was a dying one, and Darragon's last relatives had been a victim of a cave-in many decades ago, while he was still an investigator, leaving him the last of their house and line. Resh only knew this much due to a night of exotic food that had properties neither had been expecting, the result being both intoxicated for hours. During that, in a rare, unguarded moment, his mentor had shared that little tidbit, and his sorrow at its implications, of which he did not choose to elaborate on. His axe and his cane were the only things he had left to remember his family by, and Resh was determined to recover it for him, as his teacher and close friend. Resh would find that axe. He was not going to fail Darragon in this. The first week or so after the battle, they visited various vendors and merchants, often in the guise of accountants looking to settle old debts recently passed by the elf. And while they were able to obtain a great deal of information, Resh had no idea of its usefulness or value. As Darragon had kept them so busy, he had not had the opportunity to look over any of the evidence from the estate, or what references Darragon was pulling from the archives while they were out. However, soon they were making visits into the webs, and it was here that things shifted, in both of Resh's missions. At an old bar, while Conson was speaking with the owner about a group of freelance transport pilots that were known to frequent the place, Resh discovered a discarded billet for one of the many auctions that would be held in the webs. While the provenance of many of the items on sale would be suspect, the sales from such auctions kept many a web section powered and supplied. This billet described, amongst other things, a dwarven axe with a built-in bolt launcher, at least 2,000 years old. The likelihood of it not being Darragon's was quite slim. Unfortunately, the auction in question was nearly a week past. When the pilots they were looking for entered, and after a few drinks began to open up, it was revealed that they had been at the very auction, delivering last-minute food and beverages for the event. While they had little information of apparent use in the matter that had led Resh and Conson originally looking for them, they gave Resh quite a hurdle in his pursuit of the axe when they spoke of how the auction had been attacked that night after they had made their delivery, with all the attendants and staff apparently dead, and the items for sale all stolen. Returning afterwards to pass on what they had discovered that day, and having arrived just in time for dinner, Resh, Link, and Conson took some time to relax after the day's labors over a hot meal. Darragon was at last able to join them in the dining hall, and as they ate, they discussed the events of the day and the information obtained. It became clear that Darragon was ready to share some of the results of their combined efforts. The Buzzblade and their attack appeared to be a red herring, set up as a distraction to draw attention away from anything they might have discovered. Conson had conferred with several local Teltechian groups, and while the Buzzblades had a significant presence in a few of the webs, their lesser members were often hired for jobs by any number of parties. Time, place, and targets, all accompanied by the appropriate payment, is all that would have been needed to set the attack up. Further investigation who might have hired the force was pointless, as the various middlemen would not be willing to talk, no matter the inducement or threat. It appeared that the elf had been involved deeply with a large number of operations, both legal and not, across Old Polaron as an independent operator. While tracking down the details of these many business dealings would be impractical due to privacy and security concerns of the parties, it was clear that almost all of them were probably in operation still, even after his passing. This was not what caught Daragon's attention, as this was to be expected for the fields in which the elf was doing business. There would always be someone willing to fill the gap. The dozen or so operations or dealings that seemed to just cease in their existence, or concluded within a few days of the elf's passing, were far more interest to Daragon, with the select few in particular gaining Daragon's full attention. What made these deals stand out, other than the timing, was that they were on a scale far above what the elf typically dealt in, as well as being with entities that were paying via means from outside of Polaron. All through middlemen designed to obscure such matters, of course, but the scale of the funds and the materials at play limited the number of such middlemen able to deal in such amounts and maintain anonymity. These were among the deals that were unsurprisingly little to no information on, with most of the facts being assembled from the holes in other operational notes and records. For now, Daragon informed them, they would be going over everything they had gathered, as the seemingly useless information they had been gathering was anything but. And with it all together, Daragon felt they stood a solid chance of being able to identify at least one of the foreign clients, if not more. He had a particular angle he wanted to look into, but it would have to be done personally. So he would need to wait at least a few more days. During a pause a few days later, Resh stepped out to get some fresh air, as the piles of paperwork and reference materials they were using to cross-reference and check were quite dusty, and had filled the air of Runescale's home like a thin fog. Now on the other side of their host's large home, even several minutes of walking away later, the dust was still irritating the gnome's lungs. Once out on the deck, which overlooked the street a few dozen feet below, Resh took a few steps before reflexively dodging to the side as a tube landed at his feet, bouncing a few times on the deck as the rubbery casing of the tube absorbed the impact. Resh looked up to see if he could tell from where it had been dropped, but the heavy traffic in the sky lanes above made that a fool's errand. Looking down, he saw the tube had his name on it, and knowing that this was likely a bad idea, Resh opened the tube, only to find a simple note within. Sir, I am aware of your desire to obtain an item that was recently at one of our auctions. A fine piece indeed. You have an excellent eye in ancient dwarven weaponry. As you are aware, that event was interrupted, with all merchandise stolen. However, I have also become aware of your profession as an investigator, and thus offer the following deal. Aid me in the recovery of the stolen merchandise, and the axe is yours. I only ask that you keep this matter as private as you have thus far, for the benefit of all, of course. A location and a time to meet and discuss details was included. If he was to follow this lead, he would have to go immediately, as the meeting location was in a completely different part of the old city, and there was not much time to spare if he was to make it on time. Looking back, he thought that they could surely spare him for a few hours, so he could at least hear the offer out. Perhaps even gain some information on matters relating to their primary investigation. Daragon was off pursuing his private lead. Why shouldn't he? Resh set the message, and the tube containing it, down on the table in the center of the landing. With a long glance down the hall beyond the open door into the estate, Resh grinned and tossed a small rubber ball from his belt into it with a fair bit of force. It would no doubt make a bit of clatter and get someone's attention and draw them to the note. With that done, he dove off the landing, deploying his grappling lines to sling and swing himself towards his meeting. as he moved along the passages and along the edge of the sky lanes, swinging and latching onto edges and outcrops of statues and various signage. Resh felt like he was back in the troupe, performing for crowds again. He had had little opportunity to do anything like this in years, and the old city, with its vast verticality, was the perfect place to do so, while also being an extremely efficient way to get from one place to another. With only a few minutes to spare, Resh found himself approaching an elvish restaurant. It was a small place, with a handful of tables at most, likely some family business. As Resh turned and went to enter, he was seized from behind and thrown bodily into the open container compartment of a passing transport, the door snapping shut as soon as Resh impacted on the padded wall opposite it. After slowly standing, Resh could feel that they were in motion, and it felt like they were climbing. There was a chair and a side table, a bar, and very little else to be seen in the compartment as Resh looked around for a moment. "Forgive the rough treatment, but one can never be too safe in my position." A voice from the end of the compartment spoke as the bust of a man, human by the look of it, appeared in a burst of light. The man inclined his head towards the bar that could now be clearly seen as the compartment was fully lit by a soft set of lights. "Help yourself. There are med packs in there if you need them. Hopefully not, of course. I did tell them to consider your stature, but summoned workers can be a bit daft." Rush made his way to the bar, rubbing his back where a hard container pouch he hadn't realized he was wearing had left what was sure to be a healthy bruise. He poured himself a glass of water, and then sat in a large chair opposite where his host was patiently waiting. "I am pleased you chose to listen to my proposal. It is not overly complex or overly nefarious. The merchandise that was stolen from my event, which includes a pre-range dwarven axe that I understand you have an interest in, is not for the most part my concern. That the culprits are found and dealt with is. Beyond that, the rest is yours to deal with as you see fit as payment. Simple as can be." "I'm not a killer for hire." Resh let his offense clearly show at the very idea. "Of course not. Should you, however, come to a name and a location where such services would be best directed," a Trebcom tube appeared on the side table, "you would be able to leave such matters to my other associates. Just send off the information. I'm sure I don't have to impress upon you how important it is to be accurate in this. We wouldn't want any accidents." Resh took the tube and looked at his host. "Of course. So, what can you give me to work from? And what are you not saying? You say the merchandise is not a concern. For the most part. Cut the dance. What are you looking for? And what is its recovery really worth to you?" The bus smiled thinly and nodded after a moment of thought. "Fair enough. There is only one item, technically not even merchandise, that is of priority. It was at the auction house to be picked up along with our cut of the sales that night. It's some magical artifact known as the New Claw's Satchel. Supposed to be cursed or some such nonsense. All our tests have shown no meta-energies, but I have a client willing to pay an amount that makes its recovery well worth the effort. Find the satchel, find the thieves, and deal with them. The rest is yours, along with a platinum plaque. All the information on the theft is in the bag behind your chair, along with a secondary trebcom tube to inform me when you have the satchel. Good hunting." Resh stood and lifted the bag, finding folders, infotomes, and data stones inside, as the image and bust faded and the compartment door opened but a crack. The sound of air whistling lowered as the craft came to a stop, and the door opened fully for Resh to hop out. He found himself on a wide, open expanse in some sort of park, with no cubes above him. The top of the old city. Resh found a seat, and before he could reach back to grab the pouch that had bruised him on entering the transport, it leapt off his belt. Contorting in the air into its humanoid form, one of Constan's psi-form landed on the arm of the bench, and looked at Resh for a moment, and then looked around cautiously before speaking. "We must tell the others. We cannot allow a new class satchel to go unrecovered." "I intended to, but what is it?" Resh was glad that he had overlooked the small psi-forms present on his belt before he had left for the meeting, but he was sure this was the first time it had ever actually spoken to him. It merely shook his head and placed a finger to its mouth in response, then pointed to the incoming form of Constan's sky car in the distance. After Constan landed, and as Resh approached the door, it opened to a very loud and very annoyed dwarf rushing out. "By my beard, what in the world made you think this was a good idea?" Daragon stared hard at Resh before smiling. "Get in. We'll talk on the way back." As they did, and Constan secured the door, he took off. It was clear that Resh had messed up and would have to answer for it. His little rubber ball had broken several ornaments that RuneScale was less than pleased about. Besides that, Daragon was at a loss of why Resh would go without backup. The small form of the psi-form sitting on Resh's shoulder was clearly insulted by this, but said nothing. Resh handed over the bag and spoke. "Simple. That auction was not being run by low-end gangs or the like. There was organization, and thus force behind them. Just the kind of folks we need to get information from. And if we can get an in to them, as well as recover your axe, all the better. Besides, we get to keep everything else except the new cloth satchel." The Sky shuddered for just a second as Constan spun around to look at Resh. "Excuse me?" "That is the one item they want returned, and they're paying a platinum plaque for it, too." Resh looked back and sighed. "So, what is it, and why am I not going to see that plaque?" Constan, having set the autopilot, thought for a long moment before responding, glancing at the innocently whistling psi-form on Resh's shoulder. "A mistranslation and a lingual corruption, first of all, but one left uncorrected for reasons. For one, it's not a satchel. It's a backpack." He took in a long, slow breath. "And it's not new claws. It's nuclear." His head began to slowly move back and forth, as if he could not believe he was in this situation. A nuclear backpack, or backpack nuke, is a weapon of devastating potential, no bigger, than a backpack. Easily capable of bringing down the whole of the old city, even if it's on the lower end of yield. There's no way we can let something like that remain in the wild. If we find it, we need to give it to the proper authorities. Like Master Rune's scale? Rush's attempt at levity would have normally earned at least a snort from Daragon, but the old dwarf was seemingly enthralled at the various information in the bag. A moment later, his head popped up, with a wide smile on his face. That's it? It's the crates. Daragon was smiling more widely now. And yes, Master Runescale having a nuclear weapon is a fine idea. If you're looking to anger a thousands-of-year-old half-dragon, half-dwarven forge master. But also, yes, we should find this backpack nuke, and it must go that can keep to those that can keep such a thing safe. Resh held his hands up in surrender. I knew it was too good to be true, but what about the crates, Daragon? They're the key. Everything that gets moved in the old city internal shipping system has to use crates of proper features and sizes. There are every variant of size and shape you can imagine for all kinds of uses, but they have to have certain features so the system can move them, recognize them, and other matters. All these crates are made in the old city, and our dead elf was involved with each of the few certified producers of such crates at differing levels of control and influence. We knew he had his fingers in quite a few of them. Resh was completely lost at where Daragon was going with this. Not a few. All. And it seems he'd make off-the-book runs so that orgs like this one could move their stuff. Daragon showed some images of the crates of stolen merchandise. The images all but proved his words, with labels clearly identifying them as certified shipping containers. Okay, that is not my guess. Seems kind of small compared to a Nuki. It's just Nuke, Resh, Conson said, grinning. More interesting is that we can likely account for all of these in the elf's records as well, now that we have these information references to work from. If we could actually get a hold of a few of these crates, we could see how they are faking the certs, as well as what they are smuggling in the cores of the panels. Daragon held up an infotome showing the scene of the battle that happened during the auction theft. The staff were all dead or hiding under or behind whatever they could as two forces battled. One of them was recognizable, unmistakably the Buzzblades, while the other was not, only seen as shadows and clouds of darkness and smoke darting about. In the foreground of the particular image, a crate lid laid sliced in half on the ground. It looked like it was bleeding, with a dark and viscous fluid seeping out of the exposed cavity in the panel. Daragon pointed at it with a finger. Not quite sure how yet, but my bones tell me that goo is at the center of this. Well done, Resh. He smiled broadly. But you still have to deal with Runescale when we get back. A few hours later, and with Resh finally finishing the repair and cleaning work created by his actions, everyone gathered to assess what was now known. As they reviewed and dissected the various points that each thought relevant or important, it became clear that there still wasn't a clear motive behind the killing, beyond perhaps the strange goo that was apparently being smuggled in the panels of these off-the-book crates. As they reviewed what information Resh had obtained in his meeting, the presence of the Buzzblades was considered by all to be worrying. They were a widely used gang for many of the underworld, but the old city was huge, and this was a hell of a coincidence. However, the group of small shadow and smoke figures were far more interest to Runescale. Not only had they been able to fight off the Buzzblades while taking all the loot, they had done so with no losses due to the Buzzblades and the fight with them. The only death was when one of the forms ignited into flames after trying to take up Daragon's axe from its case. The other shadows left him to burn as they secured the axe carefully and made their escape. Runescale stood and went to pour himself another ale, stating that he was getting too old to solve riddles of shade and fire, but this one was plain enough to reason out. Daragon looked up confused as Resh spoke. "The doors, boss. Tell me that this is not a dwarven tunnel charge." Resh replayed a section of recording as one of the shadows ran down a buzz blade with a methodical, if rapid, charge. Runescale was smiling, nodding. "And what kind of dwarf would burn at the touch of your ancient relic axe, Daragon?" "No," Daragon said. "No, even if I thought you were right. No." Runescale's face turned hard as stone for a moment before a soft, knowing look softened it. "Daragon, you've known for a while, haven't you?" Daragon stood and turned, looking the ancient dwarf in the eye. "Only since today's revelations, but I had a gut feeling they were here. I can't do it, Runescale, so don't ask it of me." "Liar. No, worse. Coward." Do what exactly?" Resh was lost. "Your mentor is the sole remaining dwarf pledged to a task, the righting of an ancient wrong, the redemption of his clan." Daragon was never out of the focus of Runescale's stare. "I am no match for a member of the Lost Clan." Daragon's temper began to show for but a moment, before he slowly exhaled and continued. "It does, however, explain why the elf had this in a hearth vault." Daragon pulled out at what first seemed to be a small notebook, but pressing a spot on its spine, it grew to a great-sized tome, almost as large as Daragon himself. "The Lex Primus of the Lost Clan, of my clan. Within it are the secrets of runecraft, the names of every member of the clan past and present, and so much more. Must have been a form of insurance on the elf's behalf, which solidly points to them as a threat he was aware of." "Too bad non-dwarves can't read it." Runescale was smiling widely. "However, you can. One of the 4 lost artifacts of your clan, secreted away before they were betrayed and corrupted, scattered across Jam'mar and left in hidden places, or sent to ancient allies by the few to escape the damnation of your clan. Didn't the High Seer say that when all 4 were reunited, they would forge the path of atonement in the hands of the last champion?" "That is a legend, and even if I believed it, this is but one of the 4. Wisdom's Insight, Warden's Wall, and the clan's ancestral forge hammer are still lost, with the forge hammer said to be broken." Daragon shook his head mournfully. "Alzar and the Mad saw it reduced to naught but an exhibit unviewed, and a tool most simple in his final recorded vision regarding them." Runescale's smile didn't waver a bit. "If they were here, would you take the mantle? Would you become the last champion of the Stone Clans, sworn and empowered to forge Atonement's path?" Long, heavy moments of thought left Daragon's features set in a resigned, yet defiant arrangement. I would. Why the sudden change of heart? Runescale's tone was cautiously triumphant. 2 reasons. 1, they are most likely behind the murder of the elf, presumably to secure this smuggling method, if not the goo within, whatever it is. Either way, it appears as if I'm going to have to deal with them, as that is what I am being paid for. So yes, I would, were the rest of the artifacts here, of course. Very well. Locate the nest of these vermin, and I'll make the preparations. Dargon could have bored through star metal with the glare he fixed on Runescale, even as the old dwarf continued. I've had the wall and the forged hammer's head for ages, and the inside has been in your possession most of your life. He pointed at Dargon's artificial eye, as Dargon's face betrayed his shock. The fact that it accepted you was all I needed to know all the way back then as to your destiny. The other 2 have been in my private collection and museum, waiting for the time, out of sight and out of notice. Dargon touched the shell of his artificial eye and understood the truth of the Forge Master's words, but a question remained to him. That's the exhibit unviewed, but what of the tool most simple? If you have not uncovered that plain and simple truth by the time you've located the vampire's lair, I'll tell you. Oh, and what is your second reason? Runescale's smile was warm with pride, while mischief in his eyes grew. They have a nuclear weapon. Runescale's smile vanished, and the mischief bled from his eyes. I don't care, Runescale. Dargon grimaced as the elixirs of healing and the tending of his wounds worked to close and mend the open slashes across his chest and limbs. We do not have time. Resh is in the hands of the thralls of the Lost Clan. He tried again to rise from the bed he was on, only to have a firm hand pressed into his chest. Conson, who was tending to Dargon, lifted a syringe and looked the old dwarf in the eye hard. This'll put you out for a week. Don't tempt me. Conson's face softened. Until they contact us, as their note said they will, all we have is time. Dargon relented as Conson continued. We are still clueless as to the location of their lair, but if we don't go off half-crazed, there's a good chance that we can get you close. They want something, or he'd be dead. They grabbed him to trade, you must know that. Dargon merely grunted in response, knowing he had little to say in the matter currently. Runescale spoke up. How long until you can get a planked and a tankard? That and 8 hours rest, and we should be ready to proceed by then. Conson looked at the ancient dwarf. He's all but patched up. Another 5 minutes for the potions to fully be processed. Should be good to go in about 10 all told. Runescale seemed almost impressed as he turned to look at Conson's psi forms. Make sure that he eats and has at least 2 tankards. Then bed. No arguing with your elders, Dargon. Should they make contact, I will get you at once. To argue further would be a challenge to his host's honor, so Dargon lifted his hands, palms up in surrender. Oh, I think I'll be drinking a barrel. Fair enough, except I need 3 things from you before you head off. The elder dwarf swept in and deftly removed Dargon's artificial eye, as he had when they had reunited but a few months ago. Obviously, I'll need the relics for the preparations. A mischievous glint could be seen in his eye. As well as your forge hammer, Daragon. Daragon's breath halted, and he looked at Runescale as he pulled the small rock hammer that served as his forge hammer from his belt, handing what perhaps was the most personal tool a dwarf could have to the ancient. Able to be used for many crafts, forge hammers had myriad forms, and Daragon's was a small one, as his craft was in small, handheld runes and crystal smithing. No matter the size, dwarven forge hammers function much the same. Once crafted and attuned to its order, a process that took roughly a decade, typically in one's youth, the hammers would serve as the dwarf's first choice for most of their crafting uses. And Daragon had always crafted as a hobby, a way to focus his mind and allow it to untangle whatever issue or quandary was at hand. He of course knew why Runescale needed it, as the crystal at the core of the hammer would be required to mend the clan forge hammer. It would also bind that artifact of his clan to him. It would also add his experience and crafting knowledge to the collection within the hammer itself, as well as impart the vast knowledge of the hammer to Daragon to aid him. However, he was unclear on one thing. Where's the handle? Runescale stifled a chuckle. That's the third thing I need. Your cane. For what is a cane but a tool most simple? Daragon rolled his remaining eye as he hefted the solid and heavy cane at Runescale. Not to, at. By the gods, you all had me pegged for this from the start, didn't you? Runescale curtly nodded as he turned to leave. I wouldn't say that, but the universe works in mysterious ways. Now, go eat and get the rest you need. Afterwards, you will be taking the next step on your journey. Conson, with me. Boys, take care of him. With that, Runescale and Conson left Daragon and the Psi forms. The small robotic creatures, about a third of Daragon's height, helped him get up from the bed and coaxed him to the dining room. The old dwarf, initially sour at being led about, was soon mirthful as the Psi forms bounded to and fro, opening doors and making sure that Daragon didn't run into anything on his now blind side, using projected holograms to help direct and warn him of objects out of sight but in his way. By the time they had arrived at the dining hall, Daragon was already in better spirits. Even if he had not been, the meal awaiting him would have still taken his breath away. To call it a feast would be an understatement, as the spread before Daragon took up the length of the very long table. The Psi forms pulled out a seat for him and began filling his plate with meats and fine breads, all prepared in the traditional dwarven way. The tankard next to his plate was never allowed to empty before being topped off, while the finest of dwarven operas was played from a nearby music stone box. Tales of heroes and their great deeds were sung in a deep, bassy tone as Daragon heartily enjoyed the food, noticing only some time into the meal that its effects on him were more than just the result of top-notch cooking skills, but of alchemical and magical blessings and additives. The aches of his body quelled, and he felt better than he had in years, with mind and body being restored and refreshed by the meal and drink. Full, with sated appetite, and well inebriated, Daragon rose from the table and allowed the Psi forms to guide him to his room and leave him to sleep once they had arrived, making sure that the old dwarf had no more need of their assistance. Daragon was asleep as soon as his head made contact with the pillow, and he dreamt. Daragon's dream found him reliving the recent battle and loss of Reshlink. They had been tracking down the location of the vampire lair of the Lost Clan, or at least of those that had settled and set up shop in Old Polaron, when they were ambushed once again by the Buzzblades. The resulting battle was fierce and swift, with Daragon, Resh, and Constant all being separated in the chaos. Each held their own the best they could, with Daragon taking the worst of it, his age slowing his reactions. If it had not been for the entire sector going dark suddenly, with all lights losing power, Daragon may well have died. As it was, Daragon was able to disengage and find refuge in an abandoned warehouse, sliced and bleeding profusely, and was forced to tend his wounds with harsh tonics that mostly staunched the bleeding, but did little to numb the pain or restore function to his wounded limbs. When the lights came back on only a few moments later, Daragon was found by Constant, and all the Buzzblades that had assailed them were dead, either by their own hands or that of the intervening party. The identity of this party was easy enough to determine, as all the Buzzblades slain by them were missing their throats, and most were drained of any blood. In a semicircle of dead attackers against a wall, slain by both fang and summoned weapons, Reshlink's bag was found. On top of the bag was a note that simply read, "We'll be in touch." Daragon stood staring at the note in his hand as the world around him shifted and spun, and he found himself still holding the note, but now in his room, looking over his now sleeping body, confused. "You made it! Finally! Good!" A voice spoke, and Daragon turned to see a gnome sitting in the corner. Well dressed in fatigues and wearing a wide, knowing smile, the gnome stood and approached Daragon with a hand extended. "You have quite the dilemma before you, sir, and I have come to grant you aid in your most holy of quests." Daragon took the hand and shook it, still trying to figure out who this strange gnome was, and why his mind had conjured him in this dream. He didn't recognize him, and could not derive any answers from his plain, featureless clothing, as no marks of office or rank were visible. The gnome simply continued smiling, and then ended his confusion. "Daragon Stoneshaper, last of your clan, and soon to be champion of its restoration and redemption. It's an honor to meet you. I am Rolak Tagra, and your cause is one I have great interest in." Daragon stood shocked, and shaking hands with a god. What interest could he have in this whole affair? To be continued. If you'd like to contribute to the further exploration and explanation of the realms, please consider leaving a comment, a like, and sharing the video around. I read all the comments and make efforts to reply to each. Thank you for helping to grow the channel, and know I look forward to each and every one of your comments. Other methods of support can be found in the channel's description. Thank you for watching,